wake up before dawn. The air is so cold you can see your own breath inside the room. The blanket over you weighs as much as a small child. Layers of wool, then fur, then more wool, and still your feet have gone numb at the edges of the mattress. Welcome to Iron Chronicles, where we uncover the true history behind the medieval world. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. You reach out one hand toward the wall beside you and pull it back instantly. The stone is not cold. The stone is something beyond cold. It feels like touching a wound. This is an English castle. The year is somewhere in the first half of the 14th century, and a winter that has not relented in 3 months is pressing down on every surface of this building with the patience of a glacier. Outside, the temperature has dropped below freezing again. The moat has a skin of grey ice that thickens each night. And you are inside the most imposing, most expensive, most powerful structure a human being of this era could build. And you are still, inexplicably, this cold. Here is the question that should stop you in your tracks. If the nobility of medieval Europe had unlimited resources, armies of craftsmen, and generations of engineering knowledge, why did they keep building in stone? Why not timber? Why not anything that actually holds heat? Stone conducts cold the way water conducts current. A castle wall in deep winter doesn't just fail to keep warmth in, it actively pulls warmth out of any room it surrounds, radiating cold inward like a slow engine running in reverse. The answer, when it finally comes, will change the way you look at every tapestry, every floor covering, every oddly placed doorway in every castle you have ever seen. Because medieval engineers were not ignorant of the cold. They were fighting it on every single surface, and they had built an invisible system to do it. A system so layered and so precise that modern passive architecture scholars are still studying parts of it. But before we get to solutions, we need to understand exactly how brutal the problem was, because the 14th century was not just cold, it was historically, catastrophically, civilization-alteringly cold. And the people inside those stone walls had no idea what was happening to their climate, only that it was getting worse every year. The Great Famine that struck Europe between 1315 and 1322 was the direct result of years of failed harvests caused by temperature drops that modern climate data has confirmed were real and severe. This wasn't a bad winter. This was a new era, and the castle, that immovable monument to stone, had to adapt or kill everyone who lived inside it. So how did they survive? The answer starts not at the fireplace, it starts at the wall. Stand in the middle of a great hall in the dead of winter. The ceiling above you climbs 12, 15, sometimes 20 feet into darkness. The hall is wide enough to park 2 modern semi-trucks side by side. The walls, and this is the detail that matters most, are between 8 and 15 feet thick. You are not inside a room. You are inside a stone mountain that someone has hollowed out. This is where the physics of castle warmth gets deeply counterintuitive. Because that wall thickness, that enormous, crushing, expensive mass of stone, is not the enemy. It is, in the right conditions, a slow and grudging ally. Stone has a property that builders in every era have understood: thermal mass. It absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. A thick stone wall, properly managed, acts like a battery. During the day, every fire burning in the hall pushes heat outward through the air, and some of that energy is absorbed into the surrounding stone. At night, as the fire dies, the wall begins to release that stored heat back into the room, not quickly, not generously, but steadily, for hours. The medieval lord sleeping in his chamber at midnight is being warmed, in part, by a wall that has been drinking in heat since morning. The critical word, though, is properly managed. Because a stone wall, working as a thermal battery, requires one condition that is almost impossible to maintain in a medieval northern European castle during a sustained freeze. It has to reach a warm enough baseline temperature in the first place. In a mild autumn, this works. In a January that never relents, the walls never reach that baseline. They stay permanently below the threshold where they can give back meaningful warmth. And instead, they become exactly what your instincts told you they were: enormous, immovable cold radiators pressing inward from every direction. This created a crisis that no single solution could solve. And here is the part that most people get wrong about medieval castles. There was no single solution. The heating of a castle in winter was not a technology. It was a system, layered, redundant, and maintained by constant human labor and social organization. Every element of castle life, from the arrangement of rooms to the schedule of servants to the placement of doors, was shaped in part by the war against cold. And that war had a front line that was not the Great Hall, not the fireplace, not the fur-lined cloak. The real front line was something far smaller, far more personal, and hidden from almost every modern account of medieval castle life. It was the room you slept in, and medieval architects had designed that room in ways both obvious and invisible to keep you alive through the night. To understand how the system worked, you first have to understand what it was working against. And that means spending time with the physics of a great hall in February, where the fire burned, the servants moved, and the cold still found every gap it could reach. The tapestry on the wall is not decoration. Let that land for a moment. Every richly woven hanging you have ever admired in a museum, the hunting scenes, the biblical narratives, the heraldic beasts standing proud against colored wool, every one of them was doing a job. They were insulation. A tapestry hung against a stone wall created an air gap of several centimeters between the fabric and the surface, and that trapped air acted as a thermal barrier, reducing the amount of heat the wall could drain from the room. The more elaborate the tapestry, the thicker the weave, the better it worked. This was understood empirically, even if the physics had no name yet. Inventories from major English and French castles in the 13th and 14th centuries list tapestries, curtains, and woven hangings as among the most valuable movable assets in any lord's possession. Not because of their artistic value, though that was real, but because they were essential infrastructure. When a medieval lord traveled between his properties, the tapestries came with him, rolled and loaded onto carts. The rooms he left behind became immediately measurably colder. The floors told the same story. The image of medieval castle floors as bare stone is almost entirely wrong for any inhabited space in winter. Rushes were laid across the stone. Dried grass mixed with herbs, replaced periodically as they were soiled. This sounds primitive until you consider what rushes do. They trap warm air at floor level, the single coldest zone in any unheated room, creating a thin but real layer of insulation between the stone and bare feet. In wealthier spaces, thick wool carpets or animal hides replaced rushes. Some accounts describe layered floor coverings in royal chambers that, when rolled back, revealed a floor that had not been touched by cold air in months. Then there was fire, and this is where the sophistication genuinely surprises. The great hall fireplace of popular imagination, the enormous central hearth with smoke rising through a hole in the roof, was the older, less efficient design. By the late 12th and early 13th century, the most advanced castles had moved to wall-mounted hooded fireplaces with proper flue systems that directed smoke upward and outward, dramatically increasing the amount of heat that stayed in the room. The hooded fireplace was not a luxury. It was an engineering solution, and it made the difference between a room that was survivable and one that was merely dramatic. The solar was the masterpiece of the whole system. The solar, the private chamber reserved for the lord and his family, was deliberately designed small. Low ceilings, thick walls with fewer and smaller windows, positioned on an upper floor away from the cold ground. The warmth produced by the solar's own fireplace, combined with the body heat of the handful of people within it, could maintain the room at a temperature that made sleep possible without hypothermia. In a castle during a January freeze in northern England or the Rhine Valley, the solar was often the only room in the entire structure where the temperature stayed reliably above freezing through the night. Body heat was not incidental to this system, it was load-bearing. Dogs slept in the hall, not because the medieval mind was soft on animal comfort, but because a dozen dogs radiating heat into a shared space raised the ambient temperature in measurable ways. The great hall was crowded with servants, retainers, and household staff at night, all sleeping on those rush-covered floors, and their collective warmth was part of the castle's thermal budget. The lord who cleared his hall of servants for the sake of privacy was, on a cold night, making a decision with physical consequences. Here is the twist. Here is the thing that reframes everything you just learned about medieval castle heating. And it comes from a direction no one expects. The garderobe was the medieval toilet, a stone alcove, typically projecting from the outer wall, with a seat over a vertical shaft that dropped straight down the castle's exterior. Cold air came up that shaft with startling force in winter, and the garderobe was, by any rational measure, the least comfortable room in the castle. And yet, in castle after castle from the 12th century onward, the garderobe was positioned directly adjacent to, or sharing a wall with, the main sleeping chamber. The reason is smell. The ammonia fumes rising from the waste shaft were a documented preservative and repellent for wool-eating insects. Fur and woolen garments were stored in or near the garderobe, specifically because the fumes protected them. Your warmest clothes, the ones you depended on for survival, were kept in the coldest, most unpleasant room in the castle, in a closed relationship with its own waste system, because that was the only way to keep the moths out. This is medieval problem solving at its most honest. Not elegant, not comfortable, not something that translates well to a modern interior design sensibility, but effective. The garderobe as wardrobe system worked, the wool survived. And the same pragmatic logic extended throughout every heating solution in the castle. Nothing was done for comfort as a primary goal. Everything was done for survival, and comfort was whatever warmth you could extract from a system designed to keep the building functional and the people inside it alive. But there is a deeper paradox. The 14th century, the coldest, harshest period of the medieval Little Ice Age, the century of the Great Famine and the Black Death, was also the century of the most ambitious castle construction in European history. Edward I of England spent the equivalent of billions in modern currency building his chain of Welsh fortresses in the late 13th and early 14th centuries. French nobles escalated their castle programs throughout the period. German princes expanded their Rhine fortresses. Across the coldest century of the medieval era, the nobility of Europe responded to the cold by building more stone. Why? Because the castle was never primarily a home. It was a statement of power, a military installation, and a declaration that could be read from 10 miles away. Warmth was a problem to be solved within the constraints of that statement, not a constraint that shaped the statement itself. And this means that every tapestry, every hooded fireplace, every dog sleeping on a rush-covered floor was a negotiation between the demands of power and the demands of the body, conducted in real time, in real cold, by real people who had no guarantee of surviving the night. That negotiation produced something remarkable, and its legacy is not where you would expect to find it. The last fire in the Great Hall has been banked for the night. The hall is dark, except for the glow at the edges of the hearth cover. The rushes on the floor muffle the sound of breathing. 30, 40 people, curled under cloaks and rough blankets, their collective warmth doing what no single fire could do alone. Somewhere above, in the solar, the Lord sleeps behind curtains that enclose his bed like a room within a room. the thick wool fabric trapping a pocket of air warmed by his own body and those of his closest household. Outside, the temperature is dropping toward its lowest point of the night. Inside, improbably, most of them will survive until morning. The open loop that started in Chapter 1 has its answer now. Why did they keep building in stone, when stone conducts cold and traps it and radiates it inward? Because stone also endures. Because stone resists fire, siege weapons, and the slow decay that wood cannot escape. Because stone is power made visible, and power was the point. The warmth problem was real, but it was a problem to be solved inside the decision, not before it. And solve it they did, not with a single invention, but with a system that was social as much as architectural, requiring the management and constant labor of dozens of people whose work, in part, was to keep the thermal environment of the castle from killing its inhabitants. The four-poster bed with its fabric canopy is one of the most direct descendants of this system, still visible in modern life. It was not a romantic affectation. It was personal climate technology, a way of creating a small, enclosed sleeping environment where body heat could accumulate and where cold air could not freely circulate. The principle is identical to a modern sleeping bag. The implementation required 4 wooden posts and several yards of wool, but the physics is the same. Trap warm air around the human body and prevent convection from stripping it away. Passive house architecture, one of the fastest growing movements in modern sustainable building design, is built on principles that would be immediately familiar to a 14th century castle engineer. Thermal mass, air gap insulation, strategic room placement to minimize exposure of sleeping spaces to cold, the deliberate use of human occupancy as a heat source. These are not new ideas. They are very old ideas, abandoned during the era of cheap fossil fuel heating and now being rediscovered as that era ends. The rushes on the floor became underfloor insulation. The tapestry on the wall became the cavity wall. The solar became the passive solar design principle, south-facing windows, smaller rooms, upper floors. The medieval castle engineer never heard any of these terms, but they were solving the same equation, with less margin for error, in conditions where getting it wrong meant watching the people around you die of cold in the most expensive building in the county. That deserves more than admiration. It deserves recognition. If this reframed the way you see the medieval world, or the buildings you live in right now, pass it on. These stories survive because someone keeps telling them.